Before someone comes at me in the comment section like they did before saying, you've lost all credibility by saying you don't think split squats are good. I've never said that. I think split squats are fantastic. What I said is I don't think they're good for my mental health. There's a big difference between their physical effectiveness and how much they come up in my therapy sessions. I'm going to throw you a little snip out there. If you really hate split squats like some of us do, if you're doing a split squat, you can actually replace it with a single leg press. I feel bloody awful. I'm ill again. Honestly, what is life with my immune system? It's shocking. It really is. I'm still going to waffle about something and hopefully educate you about something too. GainsByBrains, the wellness diaries, training glutes, what I eat to build muscle, and food shop. I'm going to skip the eating side of things because quite frankly, building muscle from a nutritional standpoint for most people does not need to be that complicated. To build as much muscle as possible, you probably want to be in a slight calorie surplus, meaning you're consuming more calories than you're burning, and you probably want to eat enough protein. I say to play it safe, at least a gram per pound of body weight, but there are other variables that could influence that. Carb and fat intake isn't going to be massively relevant as long as you are just eating enough fat for health purposes. I usually say at least 50 grams, but again, so many variables there. Carbs, fill the rest of your calories up with that. The workout though, that's another story. I'm going to skip the warm-up because quite frankly, you should probably warm up. Warming up simply primes you for the movement ahead. Be that a bit of low-intensity steady-state cardio where you're essentially doing a bit of walking or something along those lines for some minutes, and maybe some warm-up sets of the exercise you're looking to perform. Let's say you're going to RDL 100 kilos. I'd probably warm up by going bar 60, 80, then maybe working from there. Again, trying to keep as far away from failure as possible to minimize fatigue. The RDL itself that we are seeing here, the mixed grip, I'm not backing it. I'm going to be honest with you. Quite frankly, when you're doing a mixed grip, there is a consideration that you could encourage rotation. Essentially, when you're mixed gripping, being like over under, or vice versa, there is going to be some rotation occurring. The role of the obliques, or one of the roles of the obliques, I should say, is going to be rotation, anti-rotation. So you can combat rotation with anti-rotational movements such as like the Pallof press and things like that. But why would you unnecessarily expose yourself to movements that could encourage rotation when you could simply just double overhand grip, which is bum. And again, realistically, in that you have two options, I'd say. Well, technically three. You can just double overhand grip as is, but I'd say either hook grip, probably not worth it unless you're competing, or just use straps. Honestly, do you really want your glutes and hamstrings to suffer because your grip can't keep up? And realistically, your grip will probably never keep up. So again, are you trying to train your grip? Are you trying to train your glutes and your hamstrings? The movement itself, she's going very slow. We know that from an eccentric perspective, sure, you want to control it. There's not really going to be any mad muscle gain differences between like 1 and like 8 seconds down or something ridiculous like that. Realistically, the only reason I really encourage a slower eccentric is to ensure that you're actually standardizing technique and lifting safely, effectively, and consistently. One thing we'll see here is the slow up. I think that's voluntary, which means she's voluntarily slowing the contraction speed. We kind of don't really want to do that. When we're looking at kind of like maximizing output and actually looking at like building as much muscle in this, we kind of want to look at involuntarily slowing the contraction speed. What I mean by that is once you've hit the eccentrics at the bottom of the movement, contracting as fast as you can within reason to the point that as you get closer and closer to failure, the speed of that contraction will reduce. So it goes slower and slower and slower, not because you want it to, because you're getting closer to failure and therefore you are involuntarily slowing because your muscles can't output as much anymore. That's a good time. And it seems like we're kind of supersetting this with like a sumo kettlebell squat deadlift variation. If you were doing that with a barbell, you would consider that a sumo deadlift. So let's consider it a sumo deadlift variation. And we know that when looking at the biomechanics of the movement, you're actually probably arguably getting more glute involvement doing a conventional deadlift over a sumo deadlift. Now I'm curious to hear what she has to say about the workout.
I would make sure that I have an exercise in there that is hardest when the glutes are at the shortened position, lengthened position, and then mid-range, which would mean like a glute bridge or a hip thrust variation. At the top of the movement, it's actually the hardest. You have most resistance to overcome.
In fairness, I'd actually align with that. I'm a fan of throwing in shortened position movements. Do you need to? No, you don't really need to do anything. But I think ultimately when looking at like glute training, I'm a fan of including hip thrust variations or glute bridge variations because, as she said, they're typically shortened position dominant. And quite frankly, I quite like including shortened position work for the glutes especially.
Whereas with an RDL, it is actually the hardest when the glutes are at the lengthened position, when the bar is at the bottom and you have to like bring that weight back up again.
Also valid, the RDL is very much a lengthened position movement. Again, how you RDL is very much up to you. You can RDL with slightly more bend at the knees, which means you're going to get a bit more hip travel, which means you're going to lengthen the glutes a bit further. thus favor it more of a glute dominant movement. But if you RDL with straight legs, which is arguably an SLDL, so straight leg deadlift or stiff leg deadlift, you're going to maintain slightly straighter legs, as I said, which also means the glutes aren't going to travel as far, but you're probably going to lengthen the hamstrings more, which shifts it over to be more of a hamstring dominant movement.
And then a mid-range would be the exercise that I just did, a squat variation, for example.
It's tricky because this is an argument you never win. If you're holding the kettlebell between your legs, you call it a squat variation. But if you were doing that with a barbell, you'd call it a deadlift variation. So again, I'm not saying either is right or wrong, but it's just kind of, it's a technicality there. I think when looking at like what I would kind of favor in that sense, I'd probably replace it more like a unilateral movement. So either a dumbbell walking lunge is cool, or maybe like a split squat. And going to be honest with you, again, I say it all the time, but you know my feelings about split squats. And before someone comes at me in the comment section like they did before saying, you've lost all credibility by saying you don't think split squats are good, I've never said that. I think split squats are fantastic. What I said is I don't think they're good for my mental health. There's a big difference between their physical effectiveness and how much they come up in my therapy sessions. I'm going to throw you a little snip out there. If you really hate split squats like some of us do, if you're doing a split squat, you can actually replace it with a single leg press. Because if you look at the biomechanics of what you're doing, they're largely very similar movements. And arguably, the single leg press could be a bit more stable, which somebody could argue could maybe be more effective depending on how you consider a movement to be effective. So again, if you really hate split squats, but you know you're going to do some kind of unilateral base movement that might tickle your pickle, there are options, and a single leg press is probably a good one to choose. Just adopt a higher, narrow stance to shift over that bias a bit more to the glutes. Very quickly, if you haven't already, please do consider clicking the red button down below to subscribe to the channel, as it would mean the bloody world for me and it would cure me of my illness.
And then something else that I want to do is I want to make sure that I have unilateral work in there, because especially with the glutes, since they're on the back side of your body, you can't see them. So it's actually quite easy for your stronger side to take over, and therefore the imbalances will just continue to grow. So doing any single leg exercise will be really good for combating that. And then what you want to do is you want to make sure that you start with your weaker side first, because that way your weaker side has like the opportunity to catch up.
A little sip of my Lemsip very quickly because I'm very poorly. I feel very sorry for myself. This is an interesting topic I actually want to cover, which is essentially correcting imbalances. There are so many ways you can go about this. So let's say you have a perfectly balanced body. What you would want to do if you're doing unilateral movements is you would start with whatever side you want, because in this case, we're assuming you're perfectly balanced. Let's say you start with the left side first. After you finish your left side, you would rest for a normal rest period before then going on to your right side. Although technically one set per side, but you are implementing a rest period between as if they were separate sets. So if you rest 3 minutes between sets, what I would do is your left side first, rest 3 minutes, right side, and then treat that as one set. Because if you rush into the other side, you've got considerations of motor unit recruitment. Because you are fatigued, are you now going to recruit smaller motor units, which could impact the development of the following side? Or because you are fatigued, is an external variable going to impact the effectiveness or your ability to push that following side closer to failure? So let's say I've done my left side, my right side's clear, we're all good, we're all fresh, and I haven't worked that side. There's obviously going to be some kind of overlap of fatigue there, but let's say we're relatively fresh. My breathing's out of whack, my heart rate's through the roof, and I go straight into the right side. My respiratory and cardiovascular system that wasn't impacting my left side, because I've just trained the left side, is now actually potentially going to impact my right side, meaning that maybe I'm actually going to hit failure, not because my right side has given out, but because I just can't keep up with my breath. Honestly, I'm out of breath, I'm huffing and I'm puffing. Now suddenly breathing's become a limiting factor for one side only. If you're trying to maybe make up for imbalances, what you could do, just an option. Let's say your left side is your weaker side. Do your weaker side first, so it's fresh, ready to go, ready to fight the world. Left side first, and then go immediately into the right side. Because that right side is already potentially overdeveloped and the left side is weaker, we're not too fussed about that right side not being able to keep up, and we're not too fussed about smaller motor units being recruited or external factors limiting that second side, because it's already overdeveloped, and that could potentially give you a chance to close the gap. So you'd go from weaker side first straight into the stronger side afterwards. Not saying you have to, it's just an option.
Something else that I always like to do is add some isolation work in there. So for me, I really appreciate, for example, a cable kickback. I know it's not everyone's favorite.
I don't actually disagree. I think ultimately you kind of look at a few movements there. We're looking at a thrust pattern, a hip hinge pattern, a squat variation unilateral, let's say, and a isolation pattern like a cable kickback, let's say a glute med kickback. Those which are kind of 4 movements I would actually choose as well, for very similar reasons. So we're actually very much aligned there. The thing is, with glute training, there are so many different ways to approach it, so many different things to consider, whatever it may be. But if you are confused and you aren't too sure, for less than $1 a day, the Train Heroic group coaching, that's the thing. So if you click the link down below in the description, or maybe even in the comment section, and use the code TFNL, you're going to basically get access to one of 3 programs, your choice. You've either got the gym team, the home workout team, or a pancake posse team, which is basically a training team specifically isolated for those who are looking to place more emphasis on their lower body and glutes, where basically I program it for you and update that program in real time. And then when it gets to the end of the training block, we can update that program together. I'll take your feedback on board and make a new program based on what you've told me you like and what you dislike to, again, better align with your goals as a collective, as a team. It also gives you access to the message board. It also gives you access to a full exercise library. It also gives you access to me if you want to talk to me about your training, send me footage, all that good stuff. And again, that's less than $1 a day. So if you go to the Train Heroic website and use code TFNL for this month only, for the next 4 weeks, you will get a fat juicy discount, which is pretty naughty. And if training your glutes and lower body aren't the primary objective here, you also do have an overall program, both gym focused and home workout focused. Okay, we're going back to the workout now. So it looks like we're setting up a hip thrust. I like this. So again, I've said this so many times before, hip thrust, vertical shins. I like that. I'm seeing that here. The one thing I will say about GainsByBrains is I don't know if she's doing this for the sake of videos, but I do notice on a lot of times I feel like she holds herself back regarding weight lifted. A lot of the videos I've seen, she doesn't push beyond, let's say, like 60 kilos on a lot of movements. We saw it on the hip thrust, we saw it on the RDL. I know for a fact she's a lot stronger than that, and ultimately the biggest fact to consider when looking at resistance training and progression is going to be intensity, which is proximity to failure. And sadly, a reality that most people struggle to hear, but it's actually fundamentally true, a lot of people don't train as hard as they should. And a lot of people think they're closer to failure than they actually are. Many of my clients I've spoken to, they'll do a set of leg extensions, for example, where they'll push, and they'll say, I couldn't do any more. And I was like, you've probably got about 6 or 7 left. And then we'll test that. Lo and behold, they probably had about 6 or 7 left. If you're that far from failure, how much stimulation that set is going to yield for growth is going to be drastically limited, which is only going to hold back your gains in your progression. Push harder than you think. And if you think you can't do any more, you probably can. Your mind will most likely give out before your body does. We're not trying to grow a big fat juicy brain. Maybe we do that externally, but we're trying to grow a big fat juicy bottom. Technogym, going to be honest with you, one of my least favorite brands of equipment. I hate them. Not all their stuff, but a lot of their stuff. Technogym, Matrix, just don't like how they move. I don't like how they're set up. She's now doing a seated leg curl, probably my favorite hamstring movement, to be honest, because it's very much a lengthened position dominant one, which I like. If you want to make it harder and bias that lengthened position more, which is really hard to do with the Technogym machine, lean forward, encourages a bit more stretch in the hamstrings, and will make it a lot harder, and maybe even a little bit better. And then we go into a cable kickback. Laughing, whether you want to do a regular kickback, a glute med kickback, a kickback of any other variation, a big bottom kickback, if that even exists, you do you. All I'm saying is that kickbacks aren't a bad shout. Just because it's an isolation movement doesn't mean you shouldn't lift heavy, doesn't mean you shouldn't push it, and doesn't mean you need to exaggerate how slow that movement is, because it's probably not doing you any favors for the gains. But honestly, as a whole, pretty good workout. Again, maybe didn't agree on everything, maybe we didn't align on everything, and quite frankly, maybe I'm feeling a bit grumpy and grouchy because I feel very poorly. But regardless, I actually really like GainsByBrains and her content. I think she did a good job here. And as a whole, we actually do align very much on how we would structure a glute workout, but there are many ways to consider. If that's something you aren't certain about, or maybe you want a bit more help or guidance surrounding, like I said, for less than $1 a day, you can join the Train Heroic TFNL group coaching, where I can give you that help and guidance for, like I said, less than $1 a day. But until the next one, thank you for tolerating me. Thank you for tolerating my very, very poorly voice. And thank you for tolerating the video.